The Psyops is real. You're watching Making Sense with Robbie. Let's get started. Most people have probably heard of Russiagate. It happened during the 2016 election, and it was said that Russian operatives were using social media to influence people and get them to support a candidate during the election. It's even said that these efforts were so effective that it actually influenced the election and actually changed the outcome as a result of this psychological warfare that was occurring. And it's hard to say what the truth of that was, like how significant those events were, how much they actually influenced things. But it's important to keep in mind that this is something that could happen and does happen. But basically, people were trying to affect behaviors using psychological means with online communications. A psyops is a psychological operation, but it can be also psychological warfare. And it's using emotions, it's using propaganda to influence the hearts and minds and politics of people, and to make them act in a way that is not necessarily in their best interest or act in a way that is for someone else's benefit other than their own. They're sometimes also called brain operations. And the objective of those is to convince people or trick people into believing things, into taking actions without actually having to use violence, without actually having to use weapons. It's about fighting on the psychological war front instead of on the sort of physical war front. We all have heard of propaganda, so we know that it's a thing that exists in the world and that countries use it against other countries, or even countries use it against their own citizens to influence their behavior and get them to act in a way that might be predictable. It can also include things like false flags, which are events that don't actually happen or that do happen but are sort of manipulated to make it seem like something has happened that hasn't. There's also things like called black ops or black operations, which are sort of hidden, secretive operations. And these can happen in other countries where they, replace a leader or they cause revolutions. They're not obvious or they're not announced. Like people don't know or aren't aware that they're happening, even though they can see the actual consequences and the event happening. They don't realize that those events are possibly being pushed by another government or by some kind of organization. But the general purpose of a psyops is to hijack or influence our values, to manipulate our beliefs or change our beliefs, and also to play with our emotions, to use our emotions against us. A lot of times, if we follow our emotions or if we use our emotions to make decisions, then we might not necessarily go in the right direction. It's about trying to get us to avoid using reason, trying to avoid using logic and looking at the facts and the evidence and then coming up with a reasonable conclusion or expectation or response. It's about hijacking that stuff or skipping that so that we make sort of rash, quick emotional reactions as opposed to thought out reactions. And you can say that there's fake news that influences the people. Basically, we have information that's being spread, stories that are being spread, and they're not necessarily representative of reality, but they do exist to hijack or control or manipulate the way that people think about things and events to get them to, again, behave or respond in a way that is maybe bad for their self-interest, bad for the people around them, but good for the enemy, good for the person who is sort of perpetuating or operating the psyops. And the thing about psyops is that they're kind of invisible, right? You don't really know if someone is trying to manipulate you or using psychological warfare against you because it's kind of invisible. You might see something, you might feel that what you're being presented might not be an accurate representation of reality. You might have a feeling that there's something off about the stories you're hearing or about the information that's being shared with you. But it's not the same as a physical war. When someone is performing a physical operation, you can actually see it, right? You can actually see the feet on the ground, you can see the things blowing up or whatever happens, and know that it's happening because you can see it, and you can believe that it's happening because there's this sort of physical evidence of it happening. At least it's more obvious. But with the psychological operations, they're more secretive, they're more clandestine or hidden operations, and it's not always obvious that they're taking place. And in the past, people would use loudspeakers or they'd hand out pamphlets, planes would fly over a region and they drop off papers, and those papers would have messages on them to tell the citizens or the people, believe this is what's going on, do this for your own safety or whatever. But now all of this stuff or a lot of this stuff might be actually happening online because there's so many different ways that this can be personalized. And this is also important because personalization has its benefits because it provides, this way for people to get information that's specific to them. But it also creates opportunities for advertisers to advertise really specific niches or really specific types of people. And so if a psyops was occurring, then it would be possible just to use standard advertising to target the types of individuals who might be more likely to be influenced by these behaviors. And so the internet has created lots of opportunities for these psyops, lots of opportunities for bad actors that didn't exist before. And so it's probably easier for psyops to be operated now because the technology of personalization and advertising makes it easier. And like a really obvious example, like you could say that like a military will use this against an enemy. But at the same time, like governments or internal organizations within a government might use psyops against their own citizens to influence their behavior, to influence their understanding, their values, beliefs, and in essence, the actions that they take, the way that they behave. It's just something that can happen, and there's lots of different people or motivations for why these things could happen. And while there might be some sort of military context for this idea, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, because there is a whole lot of people around the world who are using psychological operations to influence us, to motivate us, to make us take actions or behave in a certain way for the benefit of someone other than ourselves. And you always have to ask yourself, like, why are you hearing the information that you're hearing? Why is it being presented to you? Is it being presented to you because that's what's happening? Or is it being presented to you to influence your thinking, to influence your understanding, and to get you to take actions that you might not have taken otherwise? Is there a psyops happening right now? Like, why is someone trying to convince you of this? And why is that happening? What is the motivation? What is the purpose? And step back and say, well, okay, why is this happening? And maybe that will give you a little bit of clarity about how to think about things in a more safe or reasonable way. And you could say too, like, this is always happening. There's always psyops going on. There's always sort of influences trying to control the way that you think and operate. So the question then becomes, like, how much is it happening? Like, how serious is it happening? How much of what is happening is a result of a psyops? And my question to you is, like, do you fall for psyops? Do you even realize that they're happening? Have you ever sort of observed one or experienced one? And let me know what you think about that in the comments below. If you found this entertaining or informative, click that like button, because I'd really appreciate it. And if you're curious about learning how to think about things, but you don't want to be told what to think about them, then click that subscribe button, because that's what I'm here for. You've been watching Making Sense with Robbie. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk next time. Goodbye.